Hi. So, as mentioned today, we have got Patricia Miller, and I am not going to spend time talking too much about her because the best person who can tell you all about themselves is the person themselves. And or suffice to say, I think, and I'm not saying this because she's on this, YouTube podcast, whatever you want to call it. Um, Patricia has been somebody I've always looked up to. There's very few people in NHS England in my 10 years career. I would always say that, oh my God, behind the scenes, what they're up to. But, Patricia has been very, very amazing in her sort of the integrity. I think that's probably one word which has always stood out for me and always been there, supportive during difficult times for me. And that's always been appreciated. It's a tough, tough place. So, without further ado, welcome. And why didn't you tell our listeners who you are and your background? So, and then we can go from there.
Thanks, Partha. God, I feel like I've got quite a lot to live up to now. You said the words I weren't expecting. I've worked in the NHS for around 40 years. I retired last year as an ICB chief exec. I had spent the last 15 years in chief exec roles at providers and commissioner, and I made a conscious decision right at the beginning of my career that I wanted to work in almost every sector, which is quite unusual for someone at my level to have not stayed in one sector for virtually the whole of their career. But the reason why I did that is because I really wanted to understand how the system fitted together. I don't think you can do your job unless you understand what the impact is of your leadership on different parts of the system. So that was really important to me. Um, I ended up in the NHS. I say I ended up in by accident, but probably it was predestination, if I'm honest. My dad and his mum and his two sisters came here from the Caribbean in 1963, um, towards the end of the Windrush generation. I get quite frustrated when that group of people are referred to as immigrants because the reality is their countries weren't independent. They were part of the British Empire, for want of a better word, and they came with British passports. And, I'm also incredibly unfortunate because the only reason that my family weren't caught up in the Windrush generation is because my father, his complete mistrust of the government meant that rather than opting for naturalisation, he chose to apply for British citizenship and get a British passport. Otherwise, we would have been caught up in that whole immoral episode with the Home Office, and I'm really grateful to him for being so stubborn. Um, my mum, my paternal grandmother, and my aunts were all nurses, and that's why probably I say I was predestined to join the NHS in some format. I finished my A levels. I went to the Caribbean to stay with my grandfather for what was meant to be a 2 week holiday that actually turned into more like a 2 year stay of, mm, and my parents were concerned working. In actual fact, I was probably doing a little bit work and a lot of socialising. And when I came back, my mum had got me a job in the hospital where she was head of antenatal services, which is where it all started.
Mhm.
And where I stayed because I found an ability to give something back, which was really important part of being brought up as a Christian, like lots of Caribbean families.
Well, sort of, what can I say? That's a run through of a career, so to speak. And obviously, that background gives you a lot of insight as to what's going on. I was going to, go into, you're such an experience of the NHS and everything. What would you feel have been your highs? What do you think? You've looked back because, and I'll before I sort of, I just want to sort of make clear what I mean. I always do this thing where I say to people, people always ask me, and we were doing this right before we started. Hey, how are you? Are you ready? How's life? I always have this fundamental belief that if you're able to go to bed at night, without the worry of the world on your shoulders, but at the same time, it's natural. You have families and everything, but secure in the belief that you have not compromised your integrity. I think you sleep well, and I think you can go to meetings with your head held high. And you've always, in my eyes, done that. What do you feel have been the highs of your career? This wonderful work that you've done. I mean, what do you feel you turn back and go like, you know what? I was glad I was part of that journey?
I probably think two or three things. Realizing quite early in my managerial career that actually public service is not about transactions or policies or structures or targets, it's actually about people.
Hmm.
And once you realize that, you've got a choice about whether it fundamentally changes your leadership journey and how you behave as a leader. And I would hope that one of the positive impacts that I've had is seeing people as people and being the leader that is focused on caring and caring about the workforce that then leads into caring for and caring about the population and the communities.
Yeah.
That has had its positives and its negatives. You know, I am one of those people that I need to fix problems for individuals and groups, and that means you can take some of that home. You can become too personally invested in individual issues and challenges when actually you need to be taking a distance and supporting from a distance. So it has its drawbacks. I think the second thing that probably I'm really proud of is I fought really very hard to get my local hospital when I was chief exec there into the new hospitals programme for all sorts of reasons around seaside and rural community deprivation. And now that I'm retired and I drive past there regularly, I can see the buildings almost reaching completion. And that does give me a sense of achievement around fighting for that for local communities and fighting for what they really needed, not what we as public servants quite often do, which is tell communities what they need. It's fighting for what they told us they needed.
Yeah.
And then probably the last thing is using the voice that I was given and the freedom that you earn as a chief executive to speak out about inequality and try wherever you can to make a positive difference in that space. And again, that comes with some personal cost. But the reality is, you know, as Martin Luther King says, you know, bad things happen when good people stand by and watch. And so we've got, I think, once you get that senior position, it gives you the freedom to speak. You need to use that position to speak out on things that really matter, because people lower down the professional grading chain can't always do that without there being fatal consequences for their career.
Yeah, and I think for me, as a bystander, so to speak, right? I think that's always stood up. And the story about the hospital is a lovely legacy, isn't it? That just is beautiful. It's tangent, it's very tangible sort of change in lots of people's lives, those sort of things bring. But I think the value is very important because I think for the listeners who do sort of listen to this channel and stuff, and I don't say that flippantly. I mean, I've been a decade in NHS England. I've worked in different roles. I think I would struggle to find. I don't think most people are immoral. I think most people, in my view, lack strength. I think a lot of people are worried about their jobs and by nature, the protectiveness of what will happen. And the NHS is very fundamentally bad in dealing with people who try and raise objections. And I think that that's just a cultural thing which has never quite changed, unfortunately, in spite of. And I was, it's so I think in that environment, I think it's fair to say that you are seen, has always been seen, and even now I can see you're called into meetings and stuff to have that voice, right?
Mm.
That you have, and it is ironic because I don't know whether you agree with this, because a lot of people come to me, and I'm pretty sure the same with you, in private. I say, "You're so brave. You're amazing what you do." And I
Mm.
always say, well, guys, if all of you did the same thing as me, I didn't need to be brave. I wouldn't need to
Yeah,
stand out. I wouldn't be a
yeah,
maverick. A maverick is when somebody's doing something out of the ordinary.
yeah,
If you all did it, then none of us needed to be mavericks. You would be just doing, and
yeah.
I think that's a fundamental thing I really, really wonder about the NHS is that we have got to this place that somebody speaking up is a maverick. What's your experience with that?
I think that's exactly right. And I think that we've created a culture of, I remember Ned at the ICB once talking to me about toxic positivity. And I think part of it comes from The fact that when the public call us angels and clap for us on a Thursday during the pandemic, it's really difficult to look inside the organisation and be constructively critical about what actually happens. And that's why you see, a standard statement from any incident, we're learning, blah, 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 when actually people just want to know that you've actually recognised that you've made a cock up and that there's some humility there around doing something about it. I also think that, and I know this is controversial, public service in general has got institutional systemic problems with racism, and it finds it almost impossible to admit that. And until we get to a place where we're really honest about that, then we can't make the progress that we might want to in that space. And I think that there's loads and loads of examples that I've had, personal cost to me in terms of my career, that you're not popular when you speak out and say that things are not the way they should be, whether it's in quality, safety, finances, equality. It isn't accepted. It's not seen as a positive leadership behaviour. When in reality, if we're not honest about what needs to be fixed, then we can't get on and make the right decisions to make the changes that are necessary, because we're not an institution that exists for its own purpose. We're an institution that's here to serve the people of this country. And so what we do is really important. It should have integrity, it should have value, and we don't always behave in that way as a service.
Yeah, and I think it's sort of ingrained, isn't it? Two things seem to be ingrained to me. One is the fundamental philosophy of, I mean, it's ironic, isn't it? Because we say this to everybody. It's like, saying sorry is not a necessarily that you've accepted guilt, but it's basically recognizing the other person. But leadership failed to do that. Very rarely have I anybody come out and said, you know what, guys, we tried with the good faith and we didn't get it right. I have never heard anybody say that, which is absolutely amazing. And I also, in my experience, the whole system of comms, communications, what goes out is so tightly defensive.
Yeah.
And that's a problem, because I think I go back, and I was at a meeting the other day and they said, oh, well, Path, what's your view about the NHS long-term plan? And I said, well, it's a wonderful wish list. It just doesn't have any implementation behind it. And they said, oh, that's absolutely the right thing. I said, yeah, but don't get me wrong. This is not new. This has always been the case.
Yeah.
But nobody comes out and says, do you know what? We made some promises. We couldn't keep it due to many reasons, but we are sorry for not being able to keep it to you as a public. And which sort of nicely dovetails in, because my next question was going to be about some of the frustrations you have had with the NHS, and you touched upon the racism thing. It seems like a incredibly taboo thing to talk about, even though it's probably the most open secret ever, right? And I'll give you one example, and then I'll sort of ask for your views. Recently, I saw the news that one of the sickle cell centers is stopping, right? And I'm sitting there going like, wasn't it like a few months or somebody, we were like, right, we're doing so much for the Black community, and look at this, and then it's being shut, and I don't see a single person in leadership. And I think that's a very good example of what I call institutional change, right? And
Yeah.
it's fascinating to see how that is ingrained in everybody. And this is at all top tiers. I've worked with all top people. They're not racists, don't get me wrong, right? They're very, very reasonable, but it's there. It's brewed into the system, that of how it works. What's been your experience about that?
It's ingrained in the way that decisions are made. That's why I say it's institutional, it's systemic, it's in policies, it's in the way that policies are enacted. It is we have an equality impact assessment that we don't even know how to use properly, because we don't know there's no agreed definition of what equality or equity is and how do you apply it. And we don't know enough about the communities that we serve in order to be able to apply it properly. So, a really good example is the recent pronouncement from NICE on prostate screening. If white men were dying at the rate that Black men are dying of prostate cancer, we'd sure as hell have a different approach to prostate screening.
Yeah.
Nobody says we have to screen everyone. We could just have a program where we screen Black men more often. But we don't even recognise those things are issues, and the way that we are making decisions increases the likelihood of inequality rather than dismantling it. And that's why I say that until we recognise that our issues are systemic and institutional, we're not going to make the progress that we need to. We hide behind some of the outcomes that we see, and we don't even recognise that those outcomes are significantly worse in other countries in the world. If white women were dying at the rate in childbirth that black
Yeah.
women are, we would have a different approach. Medical clinical training in general is focused on the average middle-aged white man and what their outcomes might be. We don't even have training that enables people to recognize conditions that might show up differently in different cultures and different ethnicities. But we don't recognize it's a problem, or for me either that, or the problem is seen as being so big that people just shy away from even trying to tackle it because it becomes too difficult.
I'll give you a fantastic example of that, which in my experience, so in my world, right, when I started off doing the technology work, I said, so we said, we saw the difference between black children and white children getting access to technology. And I remember going into meetings going, well, where do you think it is? And they go, black people don't like technology. And I was like, really? Well, where does that come from? And they were like, well, we just think that maybe they don't like it because the disk looks white. And I was like, really? I've never heard that. That's a really weird thing to say. Are you saying black people don't wear white clothes? Because so now it's all even because I just been like, do you know what? I don't believe in this. Can you just give it to everybody who walks into the door rather than trying to make a prejudgment on them? And now we have got there. And I think it's fascinating, right? I work with Diabetes Africa, and they will tell you time and time again some of the stuff that goes on, and you go like, what does this mean? This doesn't mean anything. But you've somehow made it into a policy decision. And I think, apart from the fact, and we touch upon, I think if you look at it, even the GMC data, I always say that if you're black, you've got less chance of going into medical school, passing your exam, getting getting a training number, getting a consultant post. So you are lesser at every position. So somebody needs to explain to me, either you genuinely believe that people who are black by nature are less clever, or you've got a bias in the system. There's no other explanation for it.
Yeah.
But there we go. So okay, so we obviously touched on that. What would you feel your mess what would you again before you mess it out? So what would you like in an ideal world, if you had a magic wand, what would you like to change in the NHS? What would you like to see different going forward? Because I think it's fair to say the NHS is in trouble. I don't care how people cut the mustard and whatever they say. Everybody's fudging around data and dancing around sort of pebble stones around it. The NHS is in quite severe trouble at the present moment. Every leadership will know that and will know it where we are with the money. And I always give little examples of there is no fresh money. Salaries go up, it comes from the same budget. Drug costs go up, comes from the same budget. Everything comes from the same budget, which basically means care money is less. That's the fundamental thing. So, what would you like to change if you had the opportunity to see that happen?
Three really important things for me. So I would, first of all, stop focusing on first and second order change, which is the policy, the structure, the process, and start focusing on how do leaders need to be, how do they need to show up to deliver a good service. And that means fundamentally changing the way we look at change management and leadership development and leadership behaviour. Second thing is that it's a bit of a no-brainer in my head. The NHS, if we don't do something fundamentally different with the way it operates, in my mind, I'm concerned it's not going to exist in the next 10 years because it's too expensive.
Yep.
We currently spend £4 in every 10 of taxation on the NHS, which means all the wider determinants are not funded. That's not sustainable. So I think we need to radically think differently about how we operate. I think there's something about the NHS really stop seeing the world through the narrow lens that it does around response and start to get into the wider conversation about what does neighbourhood community actually mean and how does the NHS function as that anchor institution in that space and subsidiarity of decision making to communities. And then the third thing, which is I think is the most important, is how do we bed in equity and inclusion into the service at every level? Inequality costs the economy somewhere between 35 and 40 billion a year. That's why I say it's a no-brainer for the government, why this is not the area that we're focusing on. It's wider than social mobility.
Yeah.
It is about, first of all, organisations really embedding ED&I properly, because you can't tackle health inequalities unless you deal with it within your organisation. And then there's something about making sure that when we do leadership development training, when we look at culture and policy, when we look at accountability, it's all done through the lens of inclusion. Because when we get to a place where organisations are inclusive, one, they outperform organisations that are not by 25% or more. But two, this is not about taking something away from one group and giving it to another. It's about being pro-equity across the board. And once we do that, people feel valued, they feel cared for, and they deliver more than you're asking them to, because they know the organisation gives a damn about them. And that can only benefit the communities that you're here to serve.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I wish people listen a little bit more. I think, I worry. I worry about also not just, I'll give you a very good example. Recently, a former government minister put out something saying, it's awful that life expectancy is going down. And I had to raise the question because he's a government minister who was in government the last 10 years. I was like going, what? That's down to you guys. What? Why?
Yeah.
Why is that? Why are you putting it out, right? So I think it's a bit. I always get. I don't use the word gaslighting very often, but at the moment that's what's happening to a lot of people. Whether you go like, well, it's everybody else's fault, and I think, you're coming to a point, and I don't know what you feel about it, because I think we get too sucked into doing all the fancy stuff because it looks fancy. But
Yeah.
if you ask me as a parent, as a family person, etc., right, what would I like in the NHS? And these are my three or four worries at the present moment. And NHS has no answer. Forget about me being, and the only reason I would get probably quicker access and stuff is because I would use my privilege, sadly,
Yeah.
right? Yeah. But what is my thing? Okay, if I am ill, I would like to see my GP on time, not be fobbed off by an alphabet soup. I would like to see somebody who knows what they're doing. It's not happening. I'm really worried that even though I work in Portsmouth the last 20, 25 years, if I'm ill, I probably still will be in the queue for 12 hours before anybody sees me,
Yeah.
unless I have to phone a friend to bring me out of the queue, which is unfair on a lot of other people in the queue. I'm starting to get to an age where I'm worried about my cancer risks as it goes up. And is it going to be screened properly? And if it is it going to be seen enough in time? And I think if you're a woman, then you add on the factor, will I have a healthy, safe baby? And will it matter about the color of my skin? And at the moment, the NHS can't do those basics properly. So I always say this whenever I'm asked, and nobody listens. I go like, "Well, guys, if you did those three or four things properly, you probably would win the elections." No, nobody who's your voter, if that's what you're focused on, cares about the NHS app or your fancy AI at the present moment. They just want basic stuff to be done properly, and it's not being done.
Yeah.
So that's my view about, where things are at, and as you say, bringing that focus in. But anyway, we shall see. We shall see how it all progresses. Now, let's wrap this up with something positive. New leaders. I mean, I think what I am a big believer, and I've seen you do that a lot of times, is what I call enablement, new leadership. Open the space for them, let them come around and speak. And, what would the message for people who are coming through, are in the leadership group or thinking about leadership? And I don't mean people who are doing courses. I think people who genuinely feel that they can contribute to the system. What message would you leave them for the future going forwards? What would you like them to consider?
Well, first of all, making sure that every decision they make, that equity is at the centre of it, because I think that's critical to the NHS's survival going forward, but more importantly, really vulnerable communities being able to be confident and trust public service, and confidence and trust is at an all-time low. The second thing I would probably say is the future's in their hands. Actually, you can get to a point as in a leadership role where you think that the decisions are made by somebody above you. They're still all made by somebody above you. We wait for NHS England set the direction, blah blah blah. But actually, at a local level, you can make such a massive difference, and the future there is actually in your hands. So being brave courageous, doing the things that might make others feel uncomfortable, but you know are the right things to do, that you lead with integrity is the best gift that you can give the community and the people that you're there to look after. Because when you lead with integrity, you make decisions that are about people's best interests and not about the institution. And that really is what leadership should be all about.
Fantastic. Thank you very, very much for your time. I think it was short, sharp, but very helpful. I hope people who listen just pick some tips. I think that's all the purpose of these things are. Frustrations are part of the journey, but you also look back at successes, as you said. That's the journey. And I think sticking to it, keeping your integrity, and most important, the message that we both try to give out at all times, and you've heard today from Patricia as well, the importance of equity. It's a fundamental part and parcel of who we should be as human beings. And that's not woke. That's not anything. That's just being a good human being. So and I think you should bring that to every part of your life as you can. So thank you very much for your time, and we'll close it here, but hopefully catch up with you again somewhere sometime.
Yep, thanks, Partha.
Take care.